3, 2, 1. What I have over here is the base M5 MacBook Pro, brand new. And what I have over here is the maxed out M5 MacBook Pro. The question is, should you upgrade? Is the base model good enough for you? Why should you upgrade and why you shouldn't upgrade? Well, I've done lots of benchmarking and I'm running the one last one in here. So this is what we're gonna see in the end of the video. Does more RAM and more storage and everything else actually matter? Or is the base model good enough for you? Let's go. Now, interestingly, when you buy your MacBooks in the EU and UK, we don't actually get a charging brick with it. And the weirdest thing is, if you want to add that option on Apple's website, you're going to have to upgrade something, either the display to Nano Texture or the RAM or the storage, then you can actually add that. Let me save you some trouble and go check out Anker chargers. They're not the sponsor of this video. They sponsored the last video, but I love it so much that it's just a better option for you. So outside the frame in here, I have this tiny little charger. This is 140 watts. It's got multiple ports. It's cheaper than what Apple offers 90 watts for. It's smaller. It's just better, okay? And then if you want something portable, go check that one out. I'll leave the links in the description below. So then what are the configurations? The base model comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabytes of storage. As you notice in there, I've got this plugged in because the project that I'm rendering is too big to actually fit into the internal storage. So I do have USB 4 storage, which is super fast in there, but that might affect your workflow as well. And we'll see if that is actually the final rendering test. Is that actually gonna make a difference? In here, I have 32 gigabytes of RAM, 1 terabyte of storage. It can fit internally. And I've got the Nano Texture as well. So you can you see how it reflects the table in here? Whereas this one here doesn't reflect it at all. Both of them are running exactly the same M5 chip with 10 CPU cores and 10 GPU cores. Firstly, Cinebench R24, which is a CPU test. And when testing the base and the upgraded version, really there isn't any difference. As you can see, they're within margin of error in single core and multi-core scores. They are really snappy in the single core scores. It's absolutely ridiculous. Geekbench 6, again, similar thing. It tests lots of different things that the CPU does. This benchmark is not a factor of the RAM and storage here, so we're not bottlenecking in there, so they're within margin of error. And the same we're seeing with the GPU test when we're testing OpenCL and Metal scores on Geekbench. It's the same. We're seeing similar results. You think that is this going to be the trend for the rest of the video? Actually, absolutely not. I'll talk about the GPU later on as well, but in these tests, you're not going to notice the difference. So if you see some tests online where people are like, hey, there's no difference, that's not entirely true, which we're going to talk about. And I ran the AI benchmark test as well. Looking at the Geekbench 6 AI, whether CPU, GPU, or NPU, there doesn't seem to be any difference in terms of these tests because we're not actually testing something large, like trying to run GPT OSS on LM Studio for 20 billion parameters. In the 16 gigabytes, we should just about fit it into the memory, but it's probably struggling it and might have to unload some of them onto the CPU because you can't fit everything onto memory. But on the 32 gigabyte version, it's a whole other world. You've got so much more space to just fit stuff in there. So upgrading a RAM for AI workloads is massively beneficial. I would highly recommend that. Moving on to Photoshop. And here we can see that the upgraded version actually has a performance increase. We're seeing about 7.4% overall scores and about 14.5% in filter scores. So having more RAM, it does make a difference in Photoshop. So if you're doing anything more complex than very basic thing in Photoshop, highly recommend upgrading the RAM because it just doesn't need to swap it with the SSD and you'll see a much better performance in Photoshop. Moving on to video editing and Premiere Pro. Again, the upgraded RAM and storage version is seeing about 4.6% increase in extended scores and 7.6% in standard overall scores. In fact, the long GOP is 12% faster in extended and standard is 17.3% faster. Everything seems to be faster apart from GPU extended score, which is 1.7% slower on the upgraded version. But that just shows if you're doing something that's to do with video editing, a little bit more complex, having more RAM and storage will give you a performance increase even though you've got the same CPU. Now, when testing After Effects, that was a very obvious deal here because when trying to even load the benchmark, it just says sorry, you need at least 18 gigabytes of RAM to actually run this, whereas this one didn't even complete it, whereas the 32 gigabyte completed very, very well. Moving on to DaVinci Resolve, and here we didn't see as much of a difference because DaVinci Resolve is a lot more efficient than Premiere Pro. DaVinci Resolve likes to use more VRAM, Premiere Pro likes to use more RAM. Regardless, I'm seeing that the upgraded version of MacBook Pro is 2.5 to 3% faster in the overall scores. But again, these are just basic things that they're testing, like a simple rendering of this, simple rendering of that. If you've got multiple things on top of each other, and that's usually how editing works, you're gonna have a bit of effects, a bit of color grading, a bit of masking, a bit of filters, a bit of noise reduction. Okay, let's render this out, let's add some graphics on top. Having an upgraded RAM version will give you huge increase in that. So I'd say that the base model is for basic tasks, where if you think you're gonna do something more, then upgrading the RAM is a good idea. Looking at Blender CPU, honestly, it's just exactly the same within margin of error. In fact, the upgraded version is slightly slower. Looking at the GPU on Blender, again, the same performance difference here, about 1 to 3%, that's within margin of error. So you'll be saying to me, okay, great, I'm doing 3D, I'll go with the 16 gigabyte version. Actually, that's one of the biggest mistakes you can do. When using 3D, you most likely gonna have big canvases, and the bigger the scenes, the more RAM you really need, because that RAM is also shared between the GPU and CPU. So if you're trying to do anything 3D related, please upgrade your RAM. You're gonna see a huge benefit. Blender has made this test specifically to test the CPU performance or the GPU performance, but that does not max out the VRAM capacity or the RAM capacity. So if you're actually working with Blender, please upgrade more than 16 gigabytes. You really, really need that. In fact, any 3D work you're doing, upgrading the RAM is one of the best ideas you can do. Looking at Speedometer, which is a browser test, I can see that the upgraded version is 2% faster. So because it's really CPU based, and maybe if you've got more RAM and you've got lots of Chrome tabs open, you've got a bit of a better performance, but really, mostly you're not gonna see that big of a difference in everyday casual browsing. That 16 gigabytes is enough for you, especially if you're thinking about doing online documents or when all of your work is online really. This is what the base model here is for. If you're looking for a longer battery life than MacBook Air, if you're looking for solid constant performance, better screen, 120 Hertz, and perhaps even Nano Texture if you're working outside, you want that, because on MacBook Air you can't really get that, you can only get that with a Pro. And you want better ports, so you've got more ports and HDMI ports. So if you're doing presenting, for example, and you need to plug in HDMI port, then the Pro model is for you. You don't really need to upgrade your RAM or storage if most of your work is online. That is plenty for you. If that is what you do, that's what the base model is for. And I would recommend going with the silver one. I think it looks a little bit more classy, let me know. But moving on to Redshift, which is one of our last 3D performance tests, I can see that the upgraded version actually 5.8% faster. And interestingly, I didn't want to believe that because I ran the test multiple times and I thought it's just the GPU test, but actually Redshift does use RAM. And apparently having more RAM even in Redshift is better, but that just shows a little bit of the 3D performance we can expect when you're not having enough RAM, and it will give you a better performance. You're at this point and thinking, should you upgrade to 24 gigabytes of RAM or 32 gigabytes of RAM? Which one is enough for me? Now, I would say, like I mentioned, if you're doing basic tasks and getting a Pro model is only for really getting some of the usability, like a bit of a better battery, solid constant performance, you're never gonna throttle on the performance, it's got active cooling, better screen, then the base model is for you. But if you're doing anything mildly more than just basic tasks in photo or video editing, upgrading your RAM is a huge thing, and I think you should do that. In fact, the little secret here is the way Apple uses the RAM or memory is it fills it up. If you have more programs open, for example, than you have memory of, it will unload some of this onto your storage, so onto the SSD, and then empties it out. And then when you need it again, it reads it from the SSD. What that does is it actually uses up the SSD lifespan. And SSD lifespan can go shorter. And some of these earlier models saw increasingly that. But I would say that if you're doing lots of multitasking, your SSD performance will go down because it just has to use what's called memory swap. It swaps it with the SSD and reads it back in there. It just uses your terabyte written spec of your SSD up, and that is not a good idea. If you're doing a lot of multitasking and like to have lots of things open, having more RAM will not just give you better performance, but also longer lasts your laptop performance. If you're a photographer, I think the M5 is a really good option, especially if you're doing Photoshop or Lightroom Classic, something like that. It's fantastic. Upgrade the RAM to maximum 32 gigabytes. You'll be solid option there. If you like to do video editing, go with the Pro, M4 Pro or M4 Max version. You get more encoders and more video related things. So that might make more sense for you going there. But the M5, if you're just getting started or something like that, the M5 is a solid option, and we'll see how good this is here. So hopefully that helps you to choose between the base or upgraded version for video editing. When it comes to After Effects or some more effects things, don't go with the base model. Upgrade that, that's highly recommended, because a lot of that is to do with RAM and loading things onto the RAM. The last thing is the actual screens and display. Should you upgrade to Nano Texture display? That $150, is that worth it? Because it's almost 10% of the laptop cost when upgrading. And I would say that unless you're doing a lot of work with sunshine around and some very, very sharp lights, I think the Nano Texture might make sense for you. Now all we have to do is wait for this export test. Let me explain what you've been seeing for the rest of this video. This is a 20-minute Premiere Pro timeline where I've got lots of different codecs, lots of different things. There's color grading, there's effects, there's different resolutions zoomed in, and what it's doing is it's rendering that into YouTube 4K, and we're gonna see which one is doing a better job. Looks like the Max version is about a minute ahead, but we'll be back in a minute. Alrighty, would you look at that? We are finished. So we're gonna take a look at this one first. The base model completed it in 32 minutes and 14 seconds. The maxed up version did it in 31 minutes and 25 seconds. So we've shaved almost a minute off by having upgraded RAM, even though the CPU, GPU is exactly the same.